When I look at our history, I realize that our history is not negotiable. It's not defined by slavery. It is a profound history, and we need to teach it in honesty. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. I hope you can hear me. Hope everything is well. Welcome to the Erudition Network's interactive Black History and Knowledge session on this Thursday night. I am your host, Eddie Phillips, and I am here every Thursday to discuss with you issues and things in Black history, answering questions, listening to your thoughts and your things that you know about our history, and providing some level of understanding. Tonight, if you've been following, you realize over the last couple of days I've not been doing well. I've not felt well, but I am here tonight because I believe that this is something that we need to do every Thursday. It is essential that we spend time talking about our history and getting into the facts of it, void of rumor and sophistry and conflation and all of these things that seem to be out here in regards to our history. If you are new to the program tonight, I thank you for joining us. Please shout out, let us know that you're here. We welcome your questions, your thoughts, and we want you to make this a very interactive program. And ask questions and seek answers and evidence. So we got a couple people in here tonight. See, my brother is in here. Good to see you. Thank you. What's up, man? Good to see you in here tonight. See, my baby, my wife is here. Happy to see you, Philip. Yeah, I feel a little bit better. You know more than anybody. So I appreciate you. Eric, I see you're in here. Good to see you. Just chime in. Let us know that you're here tonight. Oh, Facebook user. Hey, for whatever reason, if StreamYard or whatever it doesn't let us know that give us a name, hey, just drop the name here so we know if you're one of our friends who watches every week or if you're just someone that's new that's dropping by. But we appreciate you being here and thank you for joining us. Oh, John, good to see you, brother. Thank you, man. All right, tonight, I spent so much time over the last hour trying to think of what we're going to talk about tonight. Because as I said, I'd been ill. And so I said, well, let's just take it to basics and let's just pull some maps. And so I went through within the last, if I were to be really honest with you, within the last 20 minutes, and I just pulled maps. And what inspired me to do that is that my son, Elliot, this week, he came up to me and he asked me, we sat down and discussed one of his homework assignments. One of his homework assignments, this was to go in and, hey, Mike, good to see you, my brother. Thank you for that information that you sent me. I'll look into it a little bit later, but I really appreciate you and Phil, man, always looking out for, for us. And, if you guys don't know, Mike, them have a great show, man, a real talk. And I want you guys, hey, Mike, drop your link up in there for people to be able to see it so that folks can follow their show. These guys talk about relevant topics. They give a spin and a perspective on it that I do believe that is needed in today's world, and especially as we look at within our Black community, we need these ideas and these thoughts to be out here. So I really appreciate, guys like Mike and Phil, Tony Briscoe, Pastor Razor, Pastor Sarton, Pastor Jones, Rodney Jones, different folks who are out here trying to teach and help and minister. My cousin Joseph Phillips. I really, really appreciate all of them, right? So please, please, please help and follow and grow these always, my brother, grow these wondrous programs that are out here to help everyone. So getting back to what I was saying about Elliot, we were talking about history, and I wasn't feeling well, but I sat there with him and I was telling him, he was a little angry with the idea of they didn't even want census in this assignment that they gave him. And what they wanted to do, and I'm going to bring up a map here that better illustrates what they're doing, because I think this is important, not just for my child's understanding, but I also think it's important because we know that there is a fight going on in history right now. And so we want to make sure that we are providing the best knowledge that we possibly can out here to our kids, and countering narratives that don't necessarily support reality, right? So what we talked about was River Valley cultures. Does anybody out there, in the spirit of this being interactive, know what I mean when I say River Valley cultures? Does anybody remember from history what that means to have a River Valley culture? Give you a moment as I drop my stuff over here. I realize I did that. River Valley culture, anybody? And if you don't have it, you don't know, you don't know. I get you, brother. If you don't, you don't know. So they're teaching, they teach all right. So we're going to talk about the River Valley cultures. I see different responses here, afraid not, having a clue, and different things like that. Sean Anthony, I'm loving your younger picture. That's crazy. Yes, it looks like it might rain. It's funny that you said that. History was my lowest subject, and a lot of people's because of the way they taught it. Civilization that were formed off, yes, Teddy, civilizations that were formed off the riverbanks, because the way that we teach history is the spread of agriculture. A culture that had an economic system as of like now Valley culture. Yes, yes, yes. Correct, John. Correct. So here's the thing. We teach this idea of river valley culture, and this is a map that is used to show some of the river valley cultures. The Indus people of India, of course, Africa, around the Nile, and China, right? Which are three major cultures. We also should talk about Sumerians and Mesopotamia and Sumer, because that should be included also. But the fact is that while we're teaching these cultures, they're also teaching the fact of how these cultures interacted with Europe. And they are centered with the idea, and I want you to look very carefully at this map. They're centered with the idea of how they are interconnected with Europe. Right? Now, I want to propose to you that if people were growing near these rivers, near these areas of flooding and water and ability to live, I submit to you that there are other places, even though historians will tell you, well, we just haven't discovered them yet, that are southern Africa. As you see so many tributaries and things that are here. Last week we talked about a man, a point where one of these men had said that the somehow the Mississippi River in America was the Nile River in Africa, and not understanding what he's talking about. But then I looked at it and I realized how these things are being spread and why they're being spread. It is important to understand the spread of agriculture and how we grow things and how we grow crops, and the need for rivers and things and tributaries to be able to provide that silt and the things that we need to grow and to create societies. Mike said he was kind of misinformed. Yes, he was terribly misinformed. And I hope, because I did invite him to watch this program, I hope that he sees this and understands that just because something is a river, right, doesn't mean that it has to be the same river. The fact is that the river cultures learned, right? Cultures learn. We learn from the Nile in Africa. I've told you all before about how Africa, why Africans had to go to the rivers, particularly the Nile. And we went into a lesson where we talked about the Wadi Kubanaya, or we should say Wadi Kubanayas, right? And we did that because we wanted to talk about why it was, right, that Africans went to those places. Because if you don't know that, then you really don't have a real good identifier of why it is we deal with what we deal with Africa. I talked to you about solar insolation, right? And I told you how the Earth changed. The Earth operates at a 23.5 degree tilt. And there was an impact, a change. And what that did is it caused incoming solar energy to reach the Earth's atmosphere and hit the surface in a way where it creates deserts and areas where the sun, the radiation is burning. So it is important for these cultures to understand and map the sun, the stars. We tell our time by solar time. But that is not the only time and actually that is not really how a lot of ancient people did. We base it because the solar time gives us our days and our nights, right? The sundial. But our ancestors saw time and signs and then things that occurred off and on the planet. When we look at something called sidereal time, right, we're talking about something that is looking not necessarily at the sun, but at the position of the planets, the position of the stars. How do we tell seasons based on what could happen because of what the planetary functions are? We know this to be the fact because as we look at those ancient cultures, we know that they paid close attention to it, and they had to in order to create the complex systems that they needed, early almanacs for growing crops, not just the sun. It would be as if you were just basing time only on an hourly basis and not minute and second. So you have to think differently. You have to think about how other things play into what it is that you're doing. The original Egyptians, right, were indigenous to Africa. And I know that angers people. But we know that based on what the Egyptians did and how they created their culture. We know that based on how they approached the things that they did in their culture and in their religion. If you understand those things first, those scientific parts of it first, and the rotation of this planet and how that tilt and that angle plays into your cultures, into your history, then you have a better understanding as to why things happen in the way that they do. Now, let's go look at the Egyptians. Let's pull up a map. And let's look at Egyptian commerce. Because once you start having agriculture, land, property, once you start to understand that we can benefit and prosper and grow, then you start to expand. You start to expand. You guys standing here. Tina, I'm terrible when answering people living pot of water because it will. You don't need the names, but we do need the understanding. Your culture learned from the Nile Valley cultures. Everybody learned how to live based on what was coming out of Africa because we know that that is where we came from. And we also understand, if you look at Africa, Africa is one of the places in the world that is surrounded by water. Whether it be the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the Atlantic, whether you go south, right, even to its east with the Indian Ocean, you see nothing but water surrounding Africa. And so it's important to know that people follow water because they can fish, because they can stay clean, because it grows crops. Yeah, the misinformed guy. This is good. Thank you. Solar known it. So yes, there are many different ways of calendars and how ancient people looked at time in ways that we don't, or I should better say we don't consider. It doesn't anger me. I don't know what you're saying like that. Children of Ham are, yes, Mizraim, based on the Bible. So when we look at this whole thing on this map of the Egyptians, right, You will notice here, this is based around 2500 BC. And what this is to show you is the Nile Delta. We create this lie in today's society that nothing else existed but the Nile Delta. But you will understand if and work with me and see here that along that delta, I was looking for my smaller map, my smaller globe. Apparently I moved it. I apologize. Sometimes that happens because I'm looking at something and I get caught up in it, but I have a smaller globe. But if you look at the Red Sea on this map, right, and as you approach the Red Sea, you will see that across from it, what we now call the Persian Gulf or the Middle East or whatever you want to, however you want to call it, all of these different things over there are all connected. Trade was going on through the Red Sea thousands of years. Egypt was not a standalone place. It was not a standalone culture. So when you look at the Nile Delta, all really that happened with the and by the grace of God is even though we had these western deserts, even though, as I told you, that interpolation was happening and there were deserts around them, every year the delta, the Nile Delta would flood. And that green area that you see here would flood. Those Kubanayas would flood. And so that meant that cultures, communities, which later became part of the Egyptian kingdom, they grew around those deltas, or around those tributaries, those little areas, those rivers, those Kubanayas, those areas that cut off. If you look closely, you can see how some of them just spear off. And they grew crops. They raised animals. The Bible tells you how much plenty the kingdom of Egypt had. It also talks to you about how even with the Nubians, right? These areas, they were fertile because of what your kids are slightly being taught about the river valley, right? People were able to grow into a culture. But if you look at something else here, you start to see that as you start to gain, people started to migrate out. And again, we are forced, I shouldn't say forced to look north and look how they communicated with the Greeks, right? Look how everything was moving into the Levant and to where you see Jerusalem, Damascus, Tyre, right? Look at all of these other kingdoms that were influenced and also interacting with Egypt because of its ability to grow and create things that were unique to Africa. And because the Delta, the Nile Delta, and its tributaries extend all the way down into southern parts of Africa, such as Kush, all of that information and technology and everything was passed upwards. But now we live in a society where people are telling us that the Egyptians weren't African. And they forget that there are multiple kingdoms. They forget what forced the people into the Nile Delta, what forced the people into the Wadi Kubanayas to be able to live, to be able to grow their society. And the knowledge that was pushed up through those areas. And as we go back and look at that other map, right? As we go back and look at the map that I showed you earlier, it takes the idea away from where that knowledge came from. I want you to look around the top part of Africa, because even though we've talked about the fact tonight that there were the deserts, right? the Sahara. Even though we look at the Sahara and we see this desert, what you will also notice is that on the western side, right, you start to see plush land, right, the wetlands. You start to see over at the top, as you get around the other parts of Africa, as you start looking at Mauritania, you start looking at what is now known as Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, right, and those coasts, they're plush. Their agriculture was great. Their commerce was great because human beings migrate around where there is water. So as you get around Cape Verde, right, as you get around Sierra Leone, Liberia, as you get around all of these different areas on this map, you start to see, even towards Nigeria, how lush those lands were. If you get further down from Egypt and you start looking into the Sudan, you start looking into Eritrea, as you start looking into Ethiopia, the places around the Red Sea, they were plush. People lived here. And they grew culture and they pushed it upwards. It would be hard, but there were tribes who did it, to make your way through the Sahara, through the desert. But all around the coast, sailing, Phoenicians, trading. And we know this historically, even though we deny it. Told you guys many times before how the African Phoenicians traveled all around the coasts of Africa long before there was ever any European doing it. But look how lush Europe is. Look how it is compared to it. And when you go back and you look at the trade, look at the trade that I showed you a moment ago into what was formerly the Hittite Empire, into Greece, right? Into Levant, into the Iberian Peninsula, what is Italy? It is important that we know why. Why? Now, as we come out of Africa, did you say? Yes, that'd be a great trip to take. It is a great trip to take if you actually learn a little about it and know where you're going to go see, what you're going to go see. It's awesome. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move into looking at Mesopotamia, as what is also known as the Fertile Crescent. Ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to ask a question. Drop a question in here tonight. I welcome your questions because I want you to engage, challenge. If you don't agree with something that I'm saying, any of that, I'm open to all of that. That's what this show, what these sessions are here to do. But let's look at Mesopotamia. So here we have the Fertile Crescent. As we move upwards and we come around over to the side or to the east of the Mediterranean Sea, and you look at Mesopotamia, the areas of Mesopotamia that you read about in the Bible with Abraham, and many of these cultures are talked about: Babylon, Nineveh, Ur. And you start to see how the Sumerians, how they formed their culture. Again, we're looking at something here where we're looking at river valley cultures, and how people make it out that these river valley cultures came to be. And as you notice, before any of this, as life extended its way out of Africa, but this is what is known, and why we are looking at this. This is what is known as the beginning of society, right? Civilization, right? Because this is what is believed to have happened in order for people to start to grow into what is now known as cities, create language, have commerce, trade, in a way where they could actually, bookkeeping in a way that they could actually record it. So people would sit down and look at what the Sumerians did, right? And a lot of it really, again, comes from bias, current historical bias, because it wasn't like that in the older, more ancient times. We spend so much time talking about the Sumerians, which is good, but not understanding that Sumer was important because it allowed us to have a created language, a written language, I should say, to actually write things down in a way to record them. Is probably one of the most important things that Mesopotamia did. It is still a river culture. In fact, that it has the Euphrates River, and it had a rich soil, and they had its own ability to trade and prosper and to grow a lot of its culture. But at the height of it, at the truth of it, it's because it was also a place where the Sumerians created written record keeping, numbers and language, and ability for folks to be able to write down what they were doing and to communicate in a way that everybody could understand. Well, those who were educated could to understand. Now, it was still a social hierarchy in the fact that you had wealthy people, and you can read the Bible and you can see that, and you can read history and see that, where you had very wealthy people sitting in the upper class of power, dictating, and probably 90% of the rest of the people were workers. Egypt was the same way. There's the Pharaoh, and then there's 90% of the people at the bottom are workers. So that's always an issue, and based on the idea of God. Why? Because God was something that these ancient people understood coming out of Egypt, out of Africa. And so they created a way for, as man will always do, for man to be seen as God. Rather you're talking about the Pharaoh, rather you're talking about the leaders in Mesopotamia, rather you're talking about even the leaders and as we get into China and other places, and even in India. But the more African we get, the less we start to see of history, right? The more African we get, and I'm going to say this because this is true, the more that is hidden. The closer we get to people looking and staying to look like Africans, the more things start to get hidden. Now, we know from ancient historians that a lot of these cultures, people were darker skinned. But what we're told about, and as you see here in that map again, is their interaction with Europe. Now, this is something that has been going on for centuries now, this obsession with Caucasus and the obsession with being in Europe and making more of what was going on in Europe than, or what we now know as Europe, than what was going on in Africa. And the truth of the matter is most of the money, import, power, and influence came from Africa. They traded stones. We have stones, cuneiform language, where we can look and we can see how they transcribed on terracotta tablets, and they made connections with other kingdoms, and they sent decrees and they sent things. All of this stuff that we found in ancient stones, none of which were going north. So when we talk about the idea of Africans having an importance in world history, we have to look at that. We have to understand that. And sometimes we fail to. I've told you guys before, it's so many people who don't want to be associated with being African. They want to see themselves as Arab, as something else. If you look at the migration patterns, and I do think I have that in one of my older presentations on here. If you look at the migration patterns, you start to see where life came from. I don't think that's the one. But you start to see where life came from and how it evolved over time, and where these patterns. Let me take this one off so you guys don't get confused. Let me see. Yeah, here's one. I'm going to show you this. As we look at the migration patterns, right, we start to see how life moved and where it came from. And you start to note, right, that all of this idea of being obsessed with Europe, that's a current. When I mean current, that's something only within the last 1,000 years that we've gotten so fixated on, so preoccupied with. But we know all of this life that came from Africa. Look, 1, 2, 3, before we ever get to the idea of Europe. But that again is the lie, right? It's the lie that keeps people preoccupied with European domination, European discovery. And we need to look at it differently. And as I'm talking to you tonight, and as I said, I pulled these maps up just a few moments before I got ready to come on tonight, because I wanted to talk about this. Because as my son was going through his assignment, and they were linking these river culture civilizations, the only thing they cared about was, well, how did all of these cultures, were they similar in how they came off of the river? Not that the cultures were inspired necessarily by each other, not that the cultures were created because people traveled and they understood how to live off of a river culture, not because of the shared knowledge or syncretism that was applied in ancient time, that did not take away from these other cultures, but also helped to grow them. That's not what we're teaching our kids. We're teaching them a connection without a connection. When you're to a point where you say, don't even make a sentence, just tell me what is similar. Oh, they had pots. They had pots. Oh, they used a wheel. They used a wheel. They had an arrow. They had an arrow. And only until we start to talk about further history, and we start to talk about how the European, or how during the Renaissance, and how people took those things and then they grew out, that's when we create a connection. And I'm telling you, as parents, as students, as people who are dedicated to learning history, that you need to take the time to draw these connections. Well, everyone We're all connected. African human beings, whatever you want, the way you want to look at it, whether you're dark skinned, whether your skin's more yellow, whether it's more red, it doesn't matter. You're all connected. But how we tell that connection story is important. Are we being imperialistic? Or are we trying to exhibit some spirit of togetherness? You sound like my wife. Yeah. She's been on me to do that for quite a while. But I agree. When you get to looking at something that can be together, it creates these connections. I say this because if you were to go and look at the Sumerians or people in Mesopotamia, and you were going to go to Africa, and you were to go to India, people had similar stories. Some people use this to disqualify the things that they read in the Bible. They tell you, well, you know, the Greeks had Hercules, and the Jews had Samson, right? The tales of Gilgamesh and all of these ancient tales, they are very similar to tales told in other lands. Why is that? Because these cultures were not just cut off to themselves. They were not sectional in the fact that only those people were the only ones who were able to tell a story. And because of the bias of human beings, because of the way and the dogma and the way we look at things, we write them in a way that fits our narrative, inspires our kids. It's the same as if I told you the story of the Little Mermaid, right? And then I changed the character from white to black to inspire a new generation of kids to see maybe beyond color, maybe to inspire black, young or dark-skinned kids to see themselves as something special also. It's the same as the movie The Wiz. We tell the Wizard of Oz, but then we tell the Wiz, right? Similar story, told in a different way. This has been going on since time immemorial, and the reality of it is, it does not take away from the truth, the fact of an incident. It just shows the twist, the bias, or the inference of the storyteller, of the historian, of the writer, of the scribe. So when we're talking tonight about these cultures and these valleys, we need to look at the connections. We need to look at how these things are connected. And the connections go really, really far in ways that a lot of us don't even consider, or maybe many of us don't even know. Let's take a look at, I took this out today. Let's take a look at this here. So this is language similarities. Whether you're Spanish, German, right? English, people had these ideas, right? Indian, on how they wrote, right? And all of them, they tend to share these just a few words, similarities. This is again taking that connection, mother, mother, father, patar, padar, padre, pater. Very similar in the way that they're pronounced, maybe different in the way that they're written, but they show you how from Persians to Hindus to the Spanish to Italy to Germany, even into our English, how we have a connection and how we say things. If you've ever talked to someone or spoken to someone from a different culture, and as they're talking, you may think that word that they use sounds familiar. And then you realize, oh man, it does have a similar meaning. We don't say it that way. Language is something that we use, right, to grow society. Was this migration start from the Tower of Babel? Could be, again, Sister Regina. This comes down to also when you look at the Tower of Babel and the things that are presented in the Bible, in Genesis, right? All those things do play a part. Cultures migrated. The Bible tells you that they did. It gives you different reasons why, but it tells you that they did. We know that people migrated and went to different places. We know that people spoke different languages, but we also know that they are closely related in their language and in their cultures because they shared those things: how to plant, how to farm. But when you can speak specifically to individuals, you go with those individuals. It's just like with genetics. Those who were more fair skinned, who could survive in more colder climates, they tended to go towards the European. They tended to go north to the Iberian coast. And we have evidence of that. We have evidence of that even in the DNA. We could trace the mitochondrial information and see why a lot of whites, as we term them today, left to go north. Why others stayed south, because it was better for them and their climate and their skin, and even the genetic alterations that happened from staying in those areas furthered it. We know when we look at the Indus people. Let's get into the Indus people, because before I get out of that, I realize I got about 15 more minutes. Let's talk about the Indus people, because one of the things that has happened in society for quite some time is that we don't tell the full story of people when it doesn't go along with the traditional narrative. And I was talking to my son and I was telling him, the early Indus people, the people of India, those who came out of Mesopotamia and went over into what we now know as India, or the Indus Valley, right? And what you see as the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, or whatever you want to term it to be today. But the truth of the matter is, they believe that these people vanished. And why is that? Why do we believe that these people vanished? Because we know historically that these people were dark of skin. And as you will find in a lot of the even American history that is told about South America, we're continually told when they can't explain why somebody is no longer there, oh, they just vanished. They just vanished. But we know the people of India are still here. We know that they are still dark of skin. We know this. But it's just easier to put them out of history. Why is it important? Because we know for a fact that from the archaeologists who have found remnants in India, in ancient India, we know for a fact that even in the Harappa Valley, which is up here, right, that they have found cities, whole cities, that were built like fortresses, whole cities that had indoor plumbing, toilets, pipes, ancient pipes and designs that are well beyond what we see in other cultures. They built in the same mud brick style as those from Africa, but the communities that they found that have been untouched, they start to find these things in the 1920s. After World War I, by accident, as they say. And they walked around and they were amazed at what they were finding in these areas as they were building railroads. Because you know, we always see the old movies where they show the trains in India, the trains to Calcutta, and all of this stuff, right? And all of these people on top of these trains. But as they went out and built these railroads, the British, they started to find that, wow, these cultures were amazing. They started to find artifacts. They started to find bronze and things, and how these people had grown these cities. But we don't talk about it, other than they were a valley culture that vanished. We don't talk about it because it doesn't necessarily fit into the narrative of advanced people beyond Europe. But we see the progression that I showed you earlier, how cultures and communities moved across spaces and time over time. We see it, but yet we aren't taught it. We're not taught it. When I was showing you all earlier, and we were talking about these things, you notice how history, it revolves and it goes around itself and it keeps coming back. They know these things to be true. But I see very few historians who teach you weekly about it. You see how on these maps, they just kind of go over, oh yeah, those cultures were in India. But it's important to know that that man migrated from Africa through Mesopotamia, into the Indus Valley, into early civilization of China. It's important to know how these cultures played into each other. It's important to understand what things were going on that made cultures move. I'm not going to go into it tonight, but we talked about Toba. We talked about Toba and the violent eruption that cut people off from other societies for better part of almost 1,000 years. And what happens in those situations, what mutates, and we know this by genetics, what mutates the people who are stuck there in those areas over time. Their skins change, the way they look change. So when you look at the people of Asia and you understand that in relation to understand that the people of China have very similar DNA to the pygmy people of Africa, you understand that they come from the same people. But what changed them? It's not saying any culture is less than the other. It's simply saying what we know to be a scientific and historical fact. When scientists talked about the Toba eruptions and what happened, people will, whatever. But God gave us DNA, gave us the understanding of DNA, a code within our bodies that allows us to be able to see and to trace how we are connected. So even though you can lie, right, narratively, linearly in time and in history, and say, oh, those people just vanished. DNA helps us to trace those things, that gap, on a genetic level. And that is why a lot of people try to teach you to not trust genetics. That's why I see a lot of people, even in our own Black community, that tell you, hey, don't go to your DNA. Because see, once you start not trusting those maps, those clues, those things that God gave you, you think that DNA doesn't exist because God, this is God who created man. And other than accepting the accepted lies, we have the opportunity to go in and actually look and see why. I remember I told a friend of mine that whites, as we see them today, it's the mutation hasn't been around very long. Maybe just under, arguably, 75,000 years. And he's like, no, that can't be. But it is the truth. We can tell if the genetics, they found it out. And there's nothing wrong with that. Somehow we have been taught that something's wrong with that. That because you are genetically a mutation or something that has happened, oh, that's wrong. But God made us adaptable creatures. Science teaches us, medicine teaches us, psychology teaches us that we are adaptable creatures. We are designed to be adaptable creatures. To interact with this world, we have to learn to adapt. If you take it from a biblical standard of Adam and Eve being pushed out of the Garden of Eden, they had to be able to adapt to a harsher climate, a rougher place. God made us adaptable in our skin color, in our fingers, in our toes, in our ability to hold our breath for a period of time, to swim underwater, even though we can't breathe underwater. We are adaptable. But somewhere, historically, we have told ourselves and told our children that this is wrong. And it's so wrong that we can't even talk about it. We've taken that syncretism that we should have, right? We've taken the homogeneity, that togetherness that we should have, and we've separated it and we've stratified it and we've categorized it. And we've subjected it to such a point that when we discuss our cultures and our backgrounds and our histories and how they all feed into each other, we have to make sure that we state, no, this culture was always better. We don't have to do that. We do it today. Ask an American what's the greatest country in the world. That's just what we do. And it informs our politics, our lives, our history, and our everything. I hope you got something from tonight. As I said, I haven't been feeling well, and I apologize if my voice was a little scratchy tonight. But I thank you all for joining us on the Erudition Network. I pulled this lesson at the last moment because I really haven't, but there was something historically my son asked me this week, and I thought it was a really good conversation to have. I continually tell people, if your children, your nephews, nieces, young folks who are being taught in school have questions on history, please, please, please send them here where we can give them a viable place, something that is factual, someplace where they can go learn and they can challenge. I would prefer a child, even though I know it angers some teachers, to get up and say, well, what about the African Phoenician? What about the Indus people who you say vanished? How did their culture do this? As opposed to giving them a lesson like they gave my son this week, where they say, just link a couple of things and that'll teach you something. It is important that we do this, that we grow this, and that we try to teach it in a way that is more representative. Let me get the last you guys' comments. And suddenly they just disappear. Yes, that seems to be a running gag in history. And then years later, scientists have discovered, then they find them again. The best nation in the world is donation. Oh, my son. Yes, hopefully it was a good lesson tonight for many of you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, God willing, we will be here again next week to share with you. Please, please, please like, share, donate, as my son says, if you want to. There's our tag at the bottom. Whatever you give to Erudition Network, I don't care if it's $1, I don't care if it's $5 or whatever. It all goes to helping us to build this network, to do the things that we would like to do, such as, like John was saying, write a book and create courses and things like that. It helps us to have the financial thing in order to do those things, and to get here each with you and provide these shows and these episodes that we provide. Share with your friends, share with your neighbors, share with those you don't like, whatever. Share them on Facebook, and share our Facebook, our YouTube pages, so that folks can start getting more involved in Erudition and speaking with us on Thursdays, Mondays, and Wednesdays. Tina will be back next Monday. The boys will be back on Wednesday, and I, God willing, will be back here on Thursday. Until then, I hope that you were blessed with this episode tonight, and I hope that you share and you grow your knowledge. Please feel free to send us questions, comments, even concerns. If you didn't like something that was presented tonight, send that to us on any of those pages, or even through our webpage at eruditionnetwork.com. You can go there, and we will be looking to get your feedback. All right. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, you be blessed. You have a wonderful and enjoyable rest of your week. Thank you. When I look at our history, I realize that our history is not negotiable. It's not defined by slavery. It is a profound history, and we need to teach it in honesty.